Thank you so much for that generous introduction. How's everybody doing? Doing okay? All right. Some thumbs up, some smiles, some head nods. Really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Department of Urban Planning and Public Policy, the Glazer Center, the School of Ecology, and everybody, the staff, the faculty, and students who have been leading this series and making it possible for me to be here. So I really, truly appreciate it. So this talk I'm going to do right now really offers a critical environmental justice reading of what I think are many generative and productive ideas that emerge from the space of the Black radical tradition, with a special focus on Black anarchist thought and politics. And so this includes engagement with writings and activities of several key figures in the Black anarchist tradition, going back to the early 20th century on up to the present. And so while these revolutionary activist intellectuals framed their ideas and their actions in ways that reflect core and evolving ideas and traditions within the broader Black freedom movement, their relevance to environmental justice theory and politics hasn't been fully explored. So in this talk, I want to ask, what lessons and insights can environmental justice and climate justice scholars and advocates learn from Black anarchist theorists and practitioners, and vice versa? So I want to demonstrate how the writings and revolutionary activities of Black anarchist traditions really reflect and extend critical environmental justice in ways that offer exciting insights and possibilities for social theory and social change. I'm going to define each of these terms, don't worry. I also show how critical environmental justice presents challenges to some of the key assumptions within the Black anarchist tradition. So what is anarchism and what is Black anarchism? These are theories and practices focused on prefiguring, embodying, and enacting radical forms of freedom and democracy. And at this particular historic moment, we're witnessing the global decline of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism and fascism. The urgency of anarchisms could not be more apparent. Moreover, we have ecocide, we have genocide, we have warfare, we have militarism, racism, ableism, cis-heteropatriarchy, speciesism, or what some scholars call dominionism, this idea of the dominance of humans over every other species on Earth. All of these oppressions have enjoyed a resurgence and expansion across both the global North and the global South in the 21st century. So it's hard for me to imagine a timelier moment for a serious engagement with both anarchism and critical environmental justice. So, what is critical environmental justice? It's a framework that seeks to understand the driving forces behind our social and ecological crises and offer some clues and some guidance for more transformative ways of thinking and acting to address them. And so I build this concept around what I call 4 different pillars. The first of which involves the recognition that social inequality and oppression in all forms intersect. So we're talking about class, gender, sexuality, ability, nationality, citizenship, race, indigeneity, etc. But also that actors in the more than human world are also subjects of oppression and agency. That is, these inequalities are mutually reinforcing and often work to maintain systems of power, privilege, and subordination. Earlier environmental justice scholarship tended to focus on a much narrower range of social categories of difference and oppression, so I'm just trying to expand that. The second pillar of critical EJ advances a multi-scalar analysis for generating a deeper grasp of the driving forces underlying environmental and climate injustices. So scale in this framework means an emphasis on both time or temporal and spatial dimensions of environmental and climate justice struggles. So an embrace of a multi-scalar methodological and theoretical approach to studying these issues is important, I think, for developing a stronger comprehension of the complex spatial and temporal causes, consequences, and possible future resolutions of climate and environmental justice struggles. While earlier environmental justice scholarship generally pursued a singular scalar approach. Let's understand, for example, what's happening in community X or community Y, or maybe on the regional scale or a national scale. We need to bring all of those together. The third pillar of environmental justice, critical EJ, is the view that social movements may be better off thinking and acting beyond the state, beyond the governmental apparatus as a target of reform and as a reliable partner. So critical EJ, environmental justice, advances the view that we should problematize state-centric approaches and ask why so many environmental and climate justice scholars insist on embracing the state, not in this limited perspective, albeit important, around a focus on the comfort of public goods, public welfare goods, services, and infrastructure, but rather from the perspective of the survival of our species, our ecosystem, and climate. We are less secure and less healthy because of nation states. So we must reimagine and reorganize our societies if we are to survive and thrive. The fourth pillar centers on a concept I call indispensability. Critical EJ extends the work of indigenous studies, ethnic studies, LGBTQ+ studies, disability justice studies, and activists and scholars across the globe in the sense that they've understood that there are multiple communities that have been constructed as and rendered expendable, surplus, devalued. So building on those ideas, critical environmental justice insists that excluded, marginalized, and othered populations, beings, and things, both human and more than human, must be viewed as indispensable to our collective futures. All of us or none. This idea is only implied at best in earlier environmental justice studies. So, what is anarchism? It's chaos, it's violence, it's horrible, right? No! Well, sometimes it is. But anarchism is actually rooted in the belief that human beings have always and can continue to exist and thrive by relying on cooperation and goodwill, rather than exclusively focusing on competition and coercion. And because the state is the most powerful institution ever devised and derives so much of its power from imposing hierarchies and coercive social structures that deny our humanity and our basic freedoms. For anarchists, they insist that the state cannot be limited, constrained, reformed, or made compatible with freedom. For anarchists, the state has to be destroyed. Having said that, a common misperception is that anarchism is exclusively fixated on challenging the state. In fact, anarchists have long viewed capitalism as just as tyrannical and harmful as states. And anarchism emphasizes the need to eliminate all authoritarian relationships and refuses, unlike so many other political and intellectual frameworks that focus on class or race or gender, etc., anarchism refuses to assign priority to any single form of dominance. They're all related. They all hold each other together. Classical anarchists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were also keenly attuned to the necessity of addressing our ecological challenges. Elisée, Reclus, and Pyotr Kropotkin, French and Russian classic anarchists, both articulated a radical theory of social ecology, arguing that the imbalances that we observe in nature are reflected in the imbalances in human relationships, so much so that sustainable human-environment relations could only be initiated through social transformation and fundamental changes in human values. Those changes in human values would then need to support the elimination, again, of all forms of hierarchy, authority, and domination. Now, the single most common question that anarchists, scholars, and activists receive from skeptics or people who are just interested and curious is as follows. How do you replace the state with some other form of organization, decision-making, security, and resource provision? The key assumption in that question is that the state is already providing those basic needs and has proven itself to be a competent, albeit imperfect, and effective means for decision-making, service provision, security, etc. Well, anarchists would challenge that assumption. Look around you, people. Is anybody paying attention? The vast majority of people on planet Earth, for us, the state is actually not providing our basic needs. The state is not a terribly effective means of collective decision-making, and it is most certainly not an effective means of providing security. Therefore, anarchists respond to that well-intentioned question that we actually do not seek to replace the state so much as instead we seek to first ask, what do we actually need as people, human beings, in a multi-species society? And how can ordinary people and our organizations and our networks meet those needs with the clear-eyed, full-throated understanding that the state has failed epically to achieve those goals through what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment and what I call targeted neglect. Lucy Parsons, an important figure in the classical anarchist period of the late 19th and early 20th century, was a black woman born into chattel enslavement who later founded the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, the most radical union this country has ever seen. Parsons was a fiery orator, nationally renowned as a labor organizer, whom the Chicago Police Department officially described as, quote, more dangerous than 1,000 rioters. I wish I could have met her. Parsons offered a passionate defense of anarchism when she wrote, quote, I came to understand how organized governments use their concentrated power to retard progress by their ever-ready means of silencing the voice of discontent if raised in vigorous protest against the machinations of the scheming few. I came to understand that such concentrated power can always be wielded in the interest of the few at the expense of the many. And for these and many other reasons, I, after careful study and not through sentiment, turned to anarchism. Because in its philosophy, I believe I can find the proper conditions for the fullest development of individual units in society, which can never be the case under government restrictions, end quote. Importantly, Lucy Parsons also framed anarchism in broad environmental terms. In many cases. In one case she wrote, quote, anarchism is a return to what I call first principles, she wrote, for were not the land, the water, the light, all free before governments took shape and form. In the future, we will again forget to think of those things as quote-unquote property, end quote. Consistent with classical anarchism, black anarchists also exhort people to practice mutual aid and collective care. Kwesi Balagoon, pictured here, was a member of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, as well as its militant wing called the Black Liberation Army. He was involved in, shall we say, expropriations, robbing Brinks trucks and banks to develop resources, money, taking from the millionaires and the billionaires and the elites to fund and support people's movements. He was also involved in the infamous prison break that led to the liberation of the revolutionary Assata Shakur. He served time in prison, not surprisingly, and transitioned to anarchism at this time. He writes, quote, where we live and work, we must organize on the ground level. The landlords must be contested through rent strikes. And rather than develop strategies to pay them rent, we should develop strategies to take the buildings, set up communes in abandoned buildings, turn vacant lots into gardens. And when our children grow out of their clothes, we should have places we can take them, clearly marked anarchist clothing exchanges, end quote. So Balagoon's statement resonates with climate justice and environmental justice theory and practices around recognizing the importance of defending the land, defending the city, as well as our built and urban environments. Contemporary black anarchism did not emerge exclusively out of the white and European anarchist movement in the United States, although it draws on some of the wisdom there. But it was largely the result of a breakaway from the Marxist-Leninist-dominated black freedom movements that many of these folks came out of. So a common theme that emerges across the biographies of black anarchists was the time they spent in prison, because they were incarcerated for all of these activities they were engaged in. But that gave them the space and the time to reflect on both the promises and the flaws within movements like the Black Panther Party. Specifically, Many black revolutionaries who were incarcerated for alleged actions that they took during their times in black social movements, like the Black Liberation Army, concluded that it was the authoritarianism, it was the heteropatriarchy within these movements that was a serious problem. But black anarchism departs from classical anarchism in many ways. Building on the critical foundation that Lucy Parsons laid, black anarchists who have followed in her footsteps have reaffirmed and extended her ideas, drawing on black feminist theory, indigenous struggles, as African American studies and literature scholar Saidiya Hartman notes in this quote. But perhaps the first and most profound lesson that black anarchism in the American context teaches us is that black people's entire lives are shaped through an implicit understanding that we are not truly a part of the society we are born into. We are not actually citizens, and our history tells us this without much ambiguity. Regarding what critical environmental justice and black anarchism can learn from each other, the first observation I will make is that black anarchism teaches us that you cannot always neatly delineate, unpack, or separate various forms of oppression that marginalized communities experience into pillars, the kinds of pillars that I have created. Accordingly, I've decided for this talk to integrate the first and the third pillars into this category of social difference, state power, and the environment, which reflects the view that anarchism is not just about abolishing the state, it is, in fact, more importantly, aimed at confronting all forms of domination. So the first pillar of critical EJ emphasizes the ways, again, in which a broad range of multiple categories of difference, inequalities, and oppressions intersect as a means of understanding the driving forces behind and the experiences with environmental and climate injustices. That's the first pillar. The third pillar, if you'll recall, of critical EJ explores the possibility of anarchist practice in a world dominated by nation states that continuously mete out punishment, exclusion, and socio-ecological violence. In both regards, social categories of difference and state power, black anarchist thought broadly aligns quite well with the critical EJ perspective. For example, one of the most generative dimensions of some forms, and there are many forms of black anarchism, is the insistence on solidarity, on joint struggle, and bridge building between black communities and other marginalized communities. Kwesi Balagoon, I'll go back to him. He writes, for example, quote, "We've got to accept the Native American struggle as our own. That means we've got to defend them, fight alongside of them, just like they fought alongside the slaves," end quote. Lorenzo Camboa Irvin is a writer, activist, and yes, black anarchist. He is a former member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the youth group that was part of the Civil Rights Movement. He was also part of the Black Panther Party. He demonstrates a keen awareness of various forms of oppression and categories of difference. And he writes, quote, "I oppose all forms of oppression found in modern society. Patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, yes, state communism, religious dictates, anti-gay discrimination. Anarchism means that we will have more democracy, social equality, and economic prosperity." Ashanti Alston, also a member of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army back in the day in the 1960s, spent more than a decade in federal prison for his activism. During that time, he was widely regarded as a political prisoner by people around planet Earth, and he also transitioned to anarchism. His politics are much more flexible and capacious than many other activists who emerged out of the black radical tradition of the 1960s. He offers solidarity and with a range of other communities and liberation movements. He told me, quote, "I really feel like of all the groups, the anarchist mindset is the one that is most open to understanding the different oppressions." He expressed his admiration of the EZLN, the Zapatista movement's vision of creating a world where many worlds can fit. And he noted that that must involve black folks indigenous folks, Chicanx, Latinx communities, queer folks, and all working class peoples. He stated, quote, many of us in the people's liberation movements, and this was at an animal rights conference, by the way, many of us in the people's liberation movements look at the animal liberation movements in the way that the media projects you. That you're all these young white kids with these funny looks, you're hugging trees, you're throwing red paint on people with fur coats, and we're like, why the hell would we want to mess with you? Until you're in situations where you may be able to talk, which I was. And then I got to step back and say, oh, wait a minute, that's what you're about. Now I get it. You go to one of these animal liberation conferences and you see these documentaries on what they're doing to animals on university campuses and research laboratories, and you think to yourself, man is a mother effer. And he repeated it, man is a real mother effer. The same ones that did this to us, Africans, then they enslaved the indigenous folks too, and the Irish. They enslaved them, they lynched them, and when these movements interact, we not only really learn about each other for the first time, but we get to share visions, end quote. So again, Alston is perhaps the most visible member of the grassroots black radical tradition who's really created common cause around racial justice, environmental, ecological, climate justice, and multi-species justice. So let's move on a little bit more to the state. Black anarchist authors Zoe Samudzi and William C. Anderson eloquently explain how the production of blackness as a social constructed category by the U.S. nation-state creates a condition of anarchy for African Americans, thus linking the social construction of race to state power. They persuasively argue that black people are residents in, but not citizens of, the United States, as this nation's legal, political, economic, and cultural system has confirmed time and time again. We go back to 1857, the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, where the Supreme Court of this country, the highest court in the land, ruled in no uncertain terms that black people are actually not citizens of the United States and were never intended for inclusion in that category. William C. Anderson is also highly aware of the relationship among whiteness, citizenship, and environmental destruction. He writes, quote, the oppressive state structure that we attempt to survive under grants extractive rights based on the idea of citizenship. Since the very beginning of the United States, the right to land and natural resources, and the right to commit acts of violence against people, indigenous, black, or otherwise, have been closely linked to citizenship. To be a citizen has meant to be white. And like whiteness, citizenship itself is an invention that is of no good use to us here. It has done far more harm than good, end quote. So he's saying if being a citizen of the United States means participating in systems of socio-ecological domination, mass violence, and harm, we want nothing to do with it. And that's something that everyone in this room should think about. So the argument that black people in America are not actually citizens of that nation is complemented by another critical point in black anarchism and other quarters within the black radical tradition, including Afro-pessimism. You have the world's leading scholars on this campus. And that is, in the Western world, black people are not considered fully human. This argument allows one to see how critical environmental justice and black anarchism align around the need to expand the concept of intersectionality within and beyond the human, an invitation to link the black radical tradition to conversations and actions, again, around multi-species justice. For example, a black anarchist network known as the Anarchatoms penned an impressive theorization of the problem of blackness as inhuman when they write, quote, the modern global system and its mass ecocide rely on what Aimé Césaire called thingification. Thingification. During slavery and colonialism, this process of thingification reduced African people's bodies to non-human objects. The quote-unquote human construct in the modern world continues to get deployed against black people and all other forms of life with horrible consequences for the lives of the most vulnerable. especially trans and disabled black folks. Anarchatas reject humanism, and we see our liberation as tied to the liberation of all non-human entities that are adversely affected by this alienating construct and the structures of capitalism, colonialism, and Eurocentrism, which ground it, end quote. So this statement broadly aligns quite well with the first pillar of critical environmental justice, in that it explains how racism, environment, and ecocide are linked, and that perhaps a generative response would be to reject the category of the human altogether, since it is an idea that is premised on domination and exclusion. That is, again, if white supremacy and Western culture cast blackness in opposition to humanness, then why continue to beg for inclusion and assimilation into a category that is rooted in violence and exclusion? And while I find this idea to be an invaluable perspective, and I actually embrace it, black anarchism and other black radical tradition scholars, I think in most cases have yet to articulate what a post-human blackness might look like, beyond that refusal, beyond that disruption. Refusal is a powerful and generative beginning, but it is only a beginning. For example, a post-human blackness might be generatively linked to new forms of multi-species justice, but Anarchata's version of that is constrained in that it is only in existence through its relevance to blackness. And unfortunately, and contrary to critical EJ's embrace of a more expansive intersectionality, this collective, the Anarchatas, appear to be focused, some might say fixated, only on people of African descent, to the neglect of others. They write, quote, Anarchatas maintain that all states are inherently anti-black structures of governance, ultimately incapable in bringing black people toward full self-determination and autonomous community formations. Anarchatas are against the existence of states everywhere due to their inherent anti-blackness, end quote. So I want to sit with that, and I have a question, which is, why shouldn't black anarchists be against the existence of all states everywhere due to their inherent violence and unfreedom for all marginalized communities, for all ecosystems? Where is the solidarity? Where is, as my colleague Shireen Saikali might say, where is the joint struggle here? For example, Anarchatas also oppose Zionism because it negatively affects black people, which is true. But this is also troubling, considering that Zionism's primary targets are Arab Palestinian communities. And as we now know, Zionism also harms Jewish communities as well. Anarchata's framework, therefore, violates a fundamental principle of anarchism in that it is a political commitment to opposing all forms of oppression, not just oppression as it concerns you or your community. Anarchata's framework also violates what is often called the first law of ecology, that all things and beings are connected. Instead, they paint a picture of the world in which peoples of African descent and their experiences with oppression and thingification are somehow entirely disconnected from those of other populations. So black anarchisms are broadly aligned with critical environmental justice, pillars 1 and 3, social difference and state power, as far as concern and opposition to climate and environmental injustice. And of course, this idea that states and capitalism must be abolished, but only partially aligned on the question of how intersectional struggles for liberation figure into visions and practices for justice. So, as with the previous segment, where I combined two pillars, 1 and 3, for the sake of a more integrated analysis, here I want to combine pillars 2 and 4. That is multiscalarity, multiscalar analyses, and indispensability. Black anarchism and critical EJ, critical environmental justice, are, once again, largely in alignment on these matters, with some exceptions. So you may be noticing a pattern. Black anarchist writings reflect concerns with multiscalarity on a spatial register by focusing, in many cases, on the black body, or bodily sovereignty, or I call that the microscale, focusing on black communities, locally, regionally, globally, the meso and macro scales, as necessary sites of struggle and resistance against various forms of oppression. Again, going back to Zoe Samudzi and William C. Anderson's contention that blackness is inherently anarchic inherently anarchic, what they call black in anarchy, because black people exist outside of the categories of state subjects and citizenship. That is also an argument about scale and space, because it indicates the fraught relationship among individual black bodies, entire black communities, and the state within the geographic space of the United States. But these writings also emphasize the urgency of understanding white supremacy and other forms of exclusion on a global scale as global social forces that must be challenged on that scale as well. Multiscalarity in the form of temporality also figures centrally in black anarchism. Again, the view that blackness is anarchic because it exists in a condition of statelessness, that is, we are not legal subjects of this country, what William Anderson and Saidiya Hartman call black in anarchy. This is at the core of anarchist practice because it is fundamentally about the here and now. That is how one's everyday experience, one's everyday existence and behaviors reflect anarchy. In this case, with a black flavor. There is, in other words, no need to wait for the revolution because it is already happening on an everyday basis as people participate in building and sustaining care economies, providing mutual aid to one another, and building and sustaining survival programs, and making collective decisions about our lives. That fact also signals the view in black anarchism that everyday practices of survival constitute direct action, an effective antidote to pessimism and despair. Moreover, the temporality of this idea about black anarchy is also about the past and the future because it is a perspective acknowledging that black folks have always been and must continue to be oppositional in order to exist. I go back to Ashanti Alston, who put it this way, quote, "I think of being black not so much as an ethnic category, but as an oppositional force, a touchstone for looking at situations differently. Black culture has always been oppositional and is all about finding ways to creatively resist oppression here in the most racist country in the world." Jazz bassist Melvin Gibbs has written a book coming out this month called How Black Music Took Over the World, and he talks about blackness as being an inherently creative and innovative category of existence where we simply have to solve problems as they are put before us. The Anarchata Collective presents a robust analysis of environmental and climate injustice that speaks to these multiple scales of power and spatiality. And they write, under the hand of the state, a small subset of people exercise material ownership over the natural resources of the planet and determine who has access to the material means of survival. Anarchatas say that capitalism is fundamentally genocidal and ecocidal as a system of accumulation that corrupts and co-opts people's relationships to one another and the environment through making our bodies and labor subject to the hands of the white, able-bodied, Christian, cis, heterosexual few. The profit-driven motives of capitalism put it on a collision course with people and the planet. There's another sentence. Anarchatas understand profit gain to be a mutation of our relationships to one another and the planet, because it monetizes our basic needs, end quote. Now, earlier I noted that black anarchists have encouraged and supported collective practices, direct action like mutual aid, providing and meeting our basic needs without the interference and coercion of the state. This generally aligns with classical anarchism. However, it also takes on a unique cultural texture that emerges from black experiences with white supremacy. Lorenzo Camball Irvin has proposed a number of concrete plans. And these may be familiar to folks who studied this history, such as a 10-point survival program, which includes community control over all housing, major input into the community planning of black communities, an end to police brutality, the establishment of black community-controlled food systems, land and building reclamation projects. I could go on and on. Irvin's vision of black anarchist praxis resonates strongly with critical environmental justice, particularly since housing, police brutality, land reclamation, health justice, food justice. These are all efforts, these are all topics that scholars and actors have reframed as environmental and climate justice concerns. Why? Because they involve marginalized communities exercising or attempting to exercise sovereignty over their bodies, over the territories they steward, and over our knowledge systems. Irvin's proposals also indicate careful attention to geographic multiscalarity in his proposals to establish community councils, neighborhood assemblies that would be organized into a mass commune which in turn would be federated on a regional and national scale. The aim being to create a national federation of black communes that would, in the absence of an overbearing violent state, be able to provide for the needs of black folks and other marginalized communities. Again, if you're familiar with some of this history, you'll note that these ideas come directly from his experience with the Black Panther Party. Black communities organizing for survival in a violent, unforgiving white supremacist society, building on those survival programs that were launched and successfully launched during the 1960s. But such plans also reflect an ethic of indispensability, because they are aimed at ensuring that all members, not just some of us, but all members of these communities have their needs met. Irvin's ethic of indispensability shines through in statements like this, right? We must have an independent, self-sustaining economy to guarantee full employment for all our people. We're deserving of all of our rights as human beings, and we should be equal in society. Now, having said that, I will admit that there is some area of tension here between Irvin's anarchism and other black anarchists in my critical environmental justice perspective, because he firmly believes that the United States government should provide key resources, funding, to support and sustain black communities. And that is in keeping with a reparations approach, right? You perpetrated the harm against our communities, well, you should pay for it. But that view, unfortunately, is in direct contrast with the anarchist credo of, quote, we make no demands. We make no demands on the state because doing so reinforces the legitimacy of the state and suggests that the state can be a site of justice and a resolution of harm, which thus runs the risk of weakening revolutionary movements' very reason for existence. In his book, Reconsidering Reparations, Olufemi Taiwo writes, quote, if slavery and colonialism built the world and its current basic scheme of social injustice, the proper task of social justice is no smaller. It is quite literally to remake the world, end quote. So the scholarly conversation around what people call world making is of critical importance because it indicates the necessity of undoing and, yes, abolishing the legal, political, and economic structures that literally created and supported the hierarchies that produced the modern world order, that gave us climate disruption, the sixth mass extinction, extraordinary social inequality, the likes of which we have never seen, certainly in modern history, and the fact that there are more human beings trafficked and enslaved on planet Earth than ever before, so much so that according to a recent study, if you added up the number of enslaved human beings on planet Earth today and the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that they produce because they tend to be concentrated in some of the most ecologically and climate destructive industrial sectors on Earth, those enslaved folks, if they were a nation, would constitute the third largest greenhouse gas emitter on planet Earth. And so I say unto you, once you hear that fact, you cannot unsee, you cannot unhear, and you cannot unknow the reality that if you care about the climate, then you must care about social justice. You can't unlink those things. So if you want to work for climate sustainability, then you've got to fight for social justice. You've got to fight enslavement. So that world making and remaking require ending the current social order. And Anarchata's statement on this is quite profound. Keep going back and forth on Anarchata's and being very critical, but also laudatory. They got some good stuff. This statement I'm going to show you reflects an awareness of multiscalarity, and I dare I say, indispensability as well. And so they write, this world, as Frantz Fanon put it, this Manichaean world, must finally come to an end. It is a world. It is a world divided into compartments borders, and partitions. It is a world that is white, where Western imperialism and colonialism have greatly extended the reach of the West with catastrophic results for third world people and for the environment. The Earth, I make this important distinction, the Earth is a sustainable collection of interconnected ecosystems. On the other hand, the world is an unsustainable mass of structures and institutions driven by consumption and exploitation. Where modern environmental movements conflate the Earth and the world, we say the world antagonizes the Earth, and we argue that the only means to stop the process of climate change, which threatens to destroy the Earth, is to liquidate the world and abolish it from our future. So in this way, what we mean by the end of the world is not the end of our planet, but the end of that world which threatens to destroy our planet. End quote. So those of you familiar with German Romanticism will see some resonances here. In other words, for Anarchatas, the world, quote unquote, is that socially constructed global society that we live in that is marked by violence, extraction, and insidious forms of hierarchy, while the Earth is our life support system that we must defend, protect, and relearn how to live with. That means, for them, we must end the world in order to ensure that the Earth and its inhabitants can live on. If you've read one of my favorite books, Rupert Reed and Samuel Alexander, it's called This Civilization is Finished. Very, very similar arguments there. It's one of the most hopeful books I've read. It's like, we've got to end this genocidal, ecocidal regime so that we can actually live, so that we can actually thrive. So as much as Anarchata's version of this idea resonates with critical environmental justice because it signals attention to the importance of multiscalarity and indispensability, the view that, quote, this world must end, or the world must end, is limiting because it actually totalizes and cedes far too much power and legitimacy to white supremacy as a social force engulfing the entire planet. In other words, recalling Ashanti Alston's admiration of the Zapatista movement's view of a world where many worlds may fit, the Anarchata idea that the world must end is inattentive to the fact of what Arturo Escobar calls the pluriverse, the reality that there are, in fact, many worlds. And while in a white supremacist world, according to many scholars, black people experience social death. In many other worlds within the pluriverse, black people exist, survive, and thrive. Yet another example about black anarchism might reflect multiscalarity and indispensability. So black anarchisms are broadly aligned with critical EJ perspectives, these pillars of indispensability and multiscalarity. There's a full embrace of this in its spatial and temporal registers, while in other forms of black anarchisms, these possibilities end at the borders of blackness and unfortunately overlook the reality of the many worlds in which black people can and do exist beyond the totalizing grip of social death. And as I've mentioned, there are some tensions between various black anarchist perspectives on making demands on the state to provide necessary resources for black survival. So, why place critical environmental justice into conversation with black anarchisms? First and foremost, the conditions and possibilities for black liberation are always rooted in and shaped by our relationship to land and ecosystems. Black anarchism's focus on freedom for black people, our bodily sovereignty, our communities, and our knowledge systems are environmental and climate justice concerns, since one cannot separate them from the ecosystems we depend on and shape every day. Even the Anarchatas have said that this is an eco-political struggle, because if we are going to achieve black liberation, we have to engage in respectful and consensual relationships with the land that we must restore and the ecosystems on which we depend. Second reason why I want to place these two things into conversation is because when you bring race, and specifically blackness, into conversation with anarchism, you can more effectively, I think, make the case for why statelessness is not at all abstract, and why it is, in fact, a reality for so many of us. As numerous black anarchists and black radical tradition scholars have argued, black folks in the United States, again, exist outside of the category of citizenship and therefore are stateless. Thus, anarchism for black people living under the conditions of white supremacy and settler colonialism is an observable fact, an everyday reality, not some naive extremist version of some future possibility. And that, I will admit, was a realization that was missing from critical environmental justice. So I thank black anarchist scholars and activists for teaching me that. Third, black anarchist writings depart from other quarters of the black radical tradition, such as Afro-pessimism, by arguing that rather than as cause for despair, cause for lack of hope, this statelessness is actually an opportunity to practice liberation and freedom, returning to the more concrete practices that black anarchists have supported and amplified. They remind us that black folks have always been at the forefront of direct action and social change because our survival depends on it, rooted in a view that the anarchic or stateless character of blackness, again, is an invitation to confront the oppression that the state delivers to our doorsteps every day. As William C. Anderson writes, our collective embrace of survival programs is one way of confronting history in order to create a better present and future. Statelessness, and this is just restating what I just said, statelessness is more than a lack of citizenship. It renders you non-existent, a shadow. So, why not embrace the darkness we're in, the darkness we are, and organize through it and with it? Use the conditions that the state has placed on us to inform our most radical incursions, rather than asking the state to change, when we should know by now that it certainly won't. The state is not for us. This sort of work, making do and building from exactly where we are, has always been a black skill. But the world around us demands that we do this with more revolutionary intentions. End quote. I would argue that just as with black statelessness, the refusal of the false lure of inclusion into the category of the quote-unquote human is also an exciting opportunity to build and imagine and practice multi-species ecological justice with all of our relations, including flora and fauna. Indigenous scholars and researchers have long engaged with these ideas that are frequently categorized today in some quarters as multi-species justice. For example, the concept of kin-centricity reflects a view that humans, non-humans, and ecosystems are actually part of an extended family with shared origins and ancestry. We know this is a fact. Kyle Powys-White, the Potawatomi philosopher and environmental studies scholar, writes, to be in a relationship with one's extended ecological family means to be transformed from a human who enjoys dominance over other species into a quote-unquote relative with reciprocal obligations. Also, Potawatomi scholar Robin Wald-Kimmerer, scientist, demonstrates in her work that the path toward ecological sustainability involves listening to, learning from, and developing reciprocal relations with our more than human relatives. Arturo Escobar calls this radical relationality, or the idea that all entities that make up the world are so deeply interrelated that they have no intrinsic separate existence by themselves, end quote. So scholars now working in this area of multi-species justice and ecological justice have also sought to build these bridges between humans and more than human communities. My colleague Petra Chakart embraces multi-species justice and argues that this is a major missing ingredient in much of the discourse and practice of climate and environmental justice movements, and I totally agree. Perhaps the black anarchist refusal of citizenship and the human can be a first step toward reframing black folks and perhaps all other folks who used to be called humans or are currently called humans as persons, relatives in a multi-species world. Our societies have always been multi-species. Above all, I contend that black anarchism is a matter of urgency and worthy of consideration because the global social order we inhabit was largely built on anti-blackness, dominionism and speciesism, and ecocide. And so, for world ending and world making to proceed, we must address that fact. Finally, and ultimately, black anarchism and critical environmental justice converge around the value of sustaining joy and hope. And as serious as these matters are, and perhaps precisely because the stakes are so high and the risks so deadly, black anarchist Lorenzo Camboa Irvin, who I've cited before already, is also clear that one must bring joy to the struggle when he stated in a recent interview, quote, "Joy is a fundamental trait of the human being, even with bullets whizzing by and whatever daunting situation you may be in. You have to feel a sense of joy to continue doing it. The joy is in doing what you're doing, and you really feel that you're accomplishing something. You can just feel that you're changing the world. You can feel the love inside you that keeps humming. You can feel these things. They're extremely important." I'll end with that. Thank you so much.